Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now, and that is very much so Ukraine. The US and Russia have been trying to lower diplomatic temperatures as tensions simmer over that part of the world. Despite senior-level talks between the top diplomats of the two sides in Geneva last Friday, US military aid has been flowing into Ukraine, the latest including lethal aid and ammo. Washington has made it clear that Moscow will incur severe economic and diplomatic costs if it invades Ukraine.
And adding to the general sense of unease, the U.S. has placed 8,500 American troops on a state of heightened alert, and the State Department has ordered families of the U.S. Embassy personnel in Ukraine to begin leaving as soon as possible. The EU has taken a different stance, announcing they are not pulling diplomats from Ukraine. For more on the crisis, we connect to Mark Barry, the associate editor of the International Journal on World Peace. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning.
So Russia continues to insist that it has no intention of invading Ukraine. But if that is the case, why do they have so many troops deployed along the border? And do you foresee Moscow actually going ahead with an invasion?
This is a class act of Russia posturing to extract concessions through very credible or seemingly credible threats. But the purpose is to weaken and even fracture what many consider to be the dated NATO alliance. NATO was constructed in order to deal with the Soviet Union during the Cold War period. But today, already Germany, interestingly, among all the EU nations, is taking a more equidistant position between NATO and Russia. And France, Britain, and the other NATO member states are just kind of nervous. So overall, this is Putin's effort to overturn the post-Cold War order that's existed since 1992 to reestablish a security environment more favorable to Russia. However, there's no popular fervor among Russians for Putin's tough talk against Ukraine. And today, Ukrainian national security officials say the U.S. is overreacting to Russia's current military buildup. This is nothing really that out of the ordinary, they say.
Now, President Biden recently had that 2-hour-long press conference where he made, you might say, a vocal gaffe by saying there might be some lesser reaction by Washington if there's a minor incursion by Russia into Ukraine. That ruffled a lot of feathers, especially in Kiev. Now, his critics argue on foreign policy Biden has had less than a stellar 12 months in his first year in the White House, including, of course, the terribly botched withdrawal in Afghanistan. How much merit do you put on critics who say that this crisis is partly due to world powers, including Russia, China, etc., sensing US weakness under the leadership of President Biden?
Obviously, President Biden is highly distracted by the COVID crisis, the Omicron crisis, and Putin is taking advantage of Biden's attention being largely on domestic matters, as well as, you mentioned, the U.S. humiliating and botched Afghanistan withdrawal. So at his January 19th press conference, Biden answered the New York Times' David Sanger's question on Ukraine with what I thought was a lot of relish. But he made a gaffe when he said that Putin would eventually invade Ukraine and that a minor Russian incursion may elicit a proportional U.S. response. So the next day, the White House and Biden himself had to clarify those comments. And some in the analyst community likened Biden's comments to Dean Acheson's statement in January of 1950 that South Korea lay outside the U.S. defense perimeter. And that clearly was a signal for Stalin to prepare, or that he took as a signal to prepare the North's invasion of the South 6 months later.
Now, Mark, President Putin said he will attend the opening of the Beijing Winter Olympics early next month, and he's expected to speak with President Xi Jinping, and they'll definitely discuss, Ukraine. But since China wants to make a successful Beijing Olympics, with no major distraction. What do you think, what message do you think would Xi convey to Putin?
Well, President Xi presides over a China that's had broad options in its foreign policy in recent years and a coordinated partnership with Russia. But in my view, Xi will not tolerate Putin carrying on in a reckless manner, in China's view, and becoming a liability to China's interests. So right now, Putin is employing threats, but using diplomacy to a certain extent, and I expect he'll take no military action against Ukraine in the lead up to the Winter Olympics, and maybe even weeks afterward, because this is China's moment on the world stage. And President Xi will emphasize this to Putin when they meet. Now, interestingly, Russia did provoke Georgia during the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympics, but China chose basically to ignore it. But both countries had different leaders 14 years ago, Hu Jintao and Dmitry Medvedev. But today, the situation is entirely different.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting meeting for sure. And finally, I just wanted to get your viewpoint, because for most people who don't closely follow world affairs, and even those of us that do, it seems like this crisis really came out of left field. Is it something that's been brewing for some time, though, in fact? And why do you think it's coming to such a head right now? You insinuated before that you think this might be more of the US media kind of playing up the situation.
There's certainly that component to it, but for Putin, he's long considered the 1991 breakup of the Soviet Union to be Russia's single greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. I mean, even more than the Great War of the 1940s. So he's trying to build, or rebuild rather, the buffer zone of friendly states that Russia once had. Also, for Putin, it's a red line for a state bordering Russia that had been a Soviet Socialist Republic since 1922, unlike the Baltic states, to become a NATO member or even to remain pro-Western, as Ukraine has since 2014. Putin will not tolerate a democratic-leaning nation on its borders. So that's why, for example, the UK Foreign Office a day ago reported Putin may be trying to install a pro-Russia leadership in Ukraine. Interestingly, Putin also knows that February is the best month for tanks, as the ground in Ukraine is frozen, but it turns muddy in March. But I do think we need cooler heads, because the worst thing to do is to overreact. And many of the things that you've reported are things that are very expected, but they don't really mean as much as we may think they mean. They're normal precautionary measures.
All right, Mark, thank you so much for the clear explanation. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.